you everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today to share with you some of Cardiff's experiences. And yes, after that great introduction, I'll just give you a bit of insight into what we've been doing at the business school. Also, I am the Director of Assessment and Feedback at the business school. However, I was only in post around October time, so I haven't had that kind of bedding in period yet to set up some of these systems as business as usual. So they tend to be relatively new pilot schemes that I'm trying to embed into practice via some form of a baptism by fire, I think. So yeah, we'll just have a little chat about some of the learning that I've experienced over the last few months. So in terms of what we're going to do, I'll just briefly introduce our assessment and feedback strategy for the school, put it into context, so look at some sizes of modules, not necessarily needing to go back into policy because Andy and Neil have already briefed us on some of those policy implications, and then just have a quick look at the project that we're doing now for the spring exams. So in terms of the business school, I know this is like death by PowerPoint, I'm not expecting you to read it. However, the point I'm making here is that we do actually have an assessment and feedback strategy that is a real life physical document and hopefully helps guide us in our mission, our goal and our specific objectives. And we share these throughout the school, and I'm hoping that as our strategy develops that we can start rolling out a lot more of these initiatives by embedding them in our strategy and then using this as a communication tool for staff members. In terms of where exam feedback sits, I don't have a specific objective documented in the strategy as yet, but this strategy is an ongoing dynamic document, and hopefully I can bed it into the 2017-2018 revision of the strategy. So I see exam feedback really sitting here in terms of increasing the overall NSS score, and I know some of you might be looking and saying, 70%? Should that not be kind of 80% with the way forward? But as I said, as late into post, so incremental improvements. Our NSS satisfaction score for the business school was 67%, I believe, for last year. So 70% for the next coming year, and then hoping to get more towards that 80% way forward target. In terms of this strategy and how we approach the various areas and the various objectives, I teach accounting, so I've taken a balanced scorecard approach, Kaplan and Norton, looking at various different quadrants and then trying to develop our initiatives as a series of measures to meet in the various different elements. And these various initiatives are largely formed from strategy, but also informed by the NSS Action Plan. And the NSS Action Plan has a varying different objectives really, including feed forward, assessment information, and one of them being exam feedback. Now, I've added the word here, individual exam feedback. I think the NSS Action Plan says exam feedback, an approach to be determined by the school. So I've taken that on board and determined a school approach, and that's what we've piloted for January, and that's what we're piloting again for the spring exams. We obviously have ongoing challenges like tight feedback for our courseworks and the 20-day turnaround, so those are just ongoing activities. So in terms of providing a bit of context about the business school, we said it's a large business school and we do have over 2,500 students. So I just thought I would just demonstrate the amount of assessments in relation to the business school by assessment type and by module size as well. So in terms of diversity of assessment practice, we're not very diverse, we're quite traditional in our exam and our coursework split. And our exams account for about 40%, maybe more, of our overall assessments. And within this 40% of our overall assessments, so we've got 551 different assessments, you'll see here that we have 59 exams that take place on modules with over 200 students. I wish I had 200 staff, that would be fantastic for 20-day marking. So you can see that between 200 and 400 students students on a module. We do have a fair few exams, and even going up into the 550, 560 students on a module. And the 550, 560 students on a module, I know that there's one marker that marks every single exam. Hence I have 20 working day issues, and also I have issues in just meeting exam boards for CARBs. So when we say that CARBs is huge, then yeah, we're talking big numbers here. And in terms of students' perspectives, the fact that there are big numbers doesn't really alter the students' perspectives, because as Neil rightly said, the student is interested in their learning experience and their assessment and their feedback. And some of the points that have been made in terms of the study at Cardiff and the NSS comments and staff student panel comments are around this lack of personal feedback on exams. And that's not just CARB students, as Neil has said, the NSS Student Charter also flags up that students want individual exam feedback. So this is the NUS Charter, as Neil's already shown you, and we're looking at this 90% of students that require feedback on exams. In terms of where we sit with policy, I don't really need to go over this, as you're all probably more aware about what the policy is, and Andy has already introduced this, but we have typed feedback for courseworks, yet, as you'll see here, the policy does not apply to examinations. So my question is, as most of our questions here today, is why? Do we get given time in the workload allocation model to provide feedback on courseworks, on exams? Is that embedded in the exam marking time? Is exam marking time purely for marking and giving a grade, a final grade, a breakdown of the grade, written feedback, handwritten feedback? So I think there's a bit of questioning really around the fact in relation to feedback on exams and what are the expectations and how does that align with the workload allocation model or not, as the case may be. In terms of other policies, we have information around a policy of only reviewing your script if you failed an assessment. And in terms of the Data Protection Act, again, students can see their scripts if there are comments on those scripts. So if there are no comments on the scripts, then the student legally at the moment, and hopefully we'll hear a lot more about this as we go on, then they do not have a right to view their exam script. So does that mean then, in terms of feedback, we do not write any comments on exams for the fear of the student then asking to see their script? And again, are we writing comments on exams for feedback to the student? Well, no, if they don't get them, and therefore we're writing comments on exams to inform our marking process, for external examiner purposes, etc. And there's been also questions asked to say, does the external examiner expect comments on the script? And therefore, if you're providing comments on exams, then how do we get those comments to the student? Otherwise, we're investing time providing feedback and not actually getting to the student. So our policy is just amalgamated from these regs, if you like. And in terms of feedback, then we should be looking at providing summary written feedback to the whole cohort within 4 working weeks. We don't have guidance on individual exam feedback. And I myself would quite like to see that written in the regs to say that you must provide typed feedback to students on exams. But it's not there, and therefore we have this issue around generic feedback and potentially individual feedback, and how can we accommodate delivering individual feedback. I don't know if any of you are aware, but Neil did undertake a bit of a consultation exercise around the reviewing of exam scripts, and we had a big consultation within the business school, and the feedback from the business school around students being able to view exam scripts was pretty negative in relation to workload and students being able to see their scripts, for example. So in terms of providing feedback on exams and handwritten comments, there is an issue here about providing those scripts and the feedback in a handwritten form back to students. So I can make these slides available to you, but really some of the business school's concerns were around the viewing of exam scripts, and it might be seen as an opportunity to renegotiate their mark. So as Andy said, that grade grubbing type culture. And also in terms of giving students the opportunity to view their scripts, actually then materialises into one of enforcing summative feedback to the exam process. And I think there's a bit of a grey area here in that should we be providing summative feedback on exams. And we've also got the issue about workload as well. So those are some of the concerns around the viewing of exam scripts, and then one of the suggestions CARBS came up with was to maybe provide an interim step, if you like. Rather than providing the script to the student, let's provide the student with a breakdown of their exam mark. So at least they can see, I did well in this question, not so well in another question, for example. So that gave rise to an exam analysis project, and we kicked off this project for the autumn exams, and it was a pilot project only for Year 2 and Year 3 students, largely because Year 2 students, we could hopefully provide them with some feedback that they can then use to feed forward, and then Year 3 students, January exams, hopefully a time for NSS, potentially, so we opened the project up to Year 2 and Year 3. In terms of projects that we've got ongoing at CARBS, this is just one of them. So we have a project charter set up, and I met with the Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning. We have a data analyst who's only a temporary data analyst, but he was able to help us develop some of these systems. And obviously our professional services staff we engage with as well. And the objective of the project was to implement an automated information system to capture individual exam mark analysis. Basically, let's use an Excel spreadsheet to get the students a breakdown of their mark. Because that's how simple it is, really. I mean, this doesn't look very simple, but the concept should be relatively simple. You give a student 60%, they had 3 questions, and they scored 20 marks in each question. Let's deliver that to the student. So the key deliverable, I said, well, let's not say 20, 20, 20, let's put it in a pretty graph, maybe make it look a bit pretty and colourful, and let's email it to the student in terms of being accessible. So the deliverable was to say to the student, yes, this is your final mark, 61%, and this is what you achieved in each question that you attempted. And largely, exams have a various number of questions, and students tend to have a choice. Also, within this feedback, if you like, and I'll call it feedback, as in a breakdown of the exam mark, hopefully trying to get some generic feedback at the same time. So ideally, a student would have breakdown of their mark, generic feedback, copy of the exam, copy of the solutions. There are obviously issues in that we don't have standardised procedures for generic feedback. Some lecturers, again, I don't know if this is a grey area, protest as to whether the student should have a copy of the exam paper and should have a copy of the solutions. It's not general practice that we provide students with that complete set of information. However, I would like it to be general practice. So that's the deliverable, and in terms of generic feedback, then this is just an example from one of my modules. Looks really scary, but an example of a generic feedback report. Now, our regs say that students should have generic feedback within 20 working days, but there's no real standards as to what we would expect. And for me as a student, generic feedback on the exam, I would hope that the exam could give me feedback in relation to students performed great in this question, or not so well in this question, and this is why. So you do need to understand how students performed on question by question basis to be able to give some valuable generic feedback, because you do need to break down the average mark of 60% was due to this question, this question, this question. So I'm trying to look at ways of standardising minimum expectations as to what generic feedback should look like. So to do this, I prepared an information sheet that we would email out to colleagues to invite them to participate in the pilot scheme, and you've each got one of those in front of you, so you're welcome to have a little look at that. They should be on the middle of the tables. Just saying, we're doing a pilot scheme. Largely now, for spring exams, we're just focusing on Year 2, because Year 3 students are leaving. But I'll give you an interesting point to note about that in a minute. But Year 2 students for the spring exams. And in terms of spring exams for Year 2, this applies only to about 37 modules, I believe. So not too many modules for this spring pilot. And in terms of what the pilot is, our process involves the Herb sending out an email to staff saying, please participate in this pilot scheme. We'll send you a spreadsheet and we'd like you to record how students have performed in each of these questions. And by recording that, you'll be able to say student numbers for 20, 20, 20, and it'll add up the fact that your exam marks should be 60%. And then the Herb get the mark sheet back from the academic, uploads the CSV file onto Sims, because we've got automatic upload, and then an MI team, that is essentially myself and a temporary data analyst, collect these mark sheets and store this information. At the moment we're storing it in an Access database, and hopefully that will give us greater functionality to send out to students groupings of marks, or to maybe use the information at a modular level for analysing module performance prior to exam boards, etc. We also then generate individual PDFs for students and then mail merge them out to students. So I'll just run through a couple of screenshots for the process. We run off an Excel sheet. It's not highly sophisticated. I haven't had lots of funding to go and do this. It's just trying to look at what we can use in-house, really. So an Excel spreadsheet with a series of macros, nice little buttons that help do things behind the scenes. And this is what gets sent out to the academic. So a list of all the students and then boxes they can fill in, 20, 20, 20, 20, 30, 30, etc. And the student gets 60%. So the academic records the marks. The academic gets sent an email with the mark sheet, with an information sheet, etc., with an example of some of the generic feedback also that we can generate behind the scenes. So we not only have individual question numbers here and the individual marks, but we can generate that generic feedback as well. And that generic feedback also then helps the moderation process. So the feedback report then goes to the moderator and acts as an internal examiner report. So that mark sheet goes out, it gets populated, it comes back in, and then professional services staff can automatically upload those marks into Sims. We keep an Access database of all the students' information, all of the marks, etc. And then we email the student their results. So it's quite a lot of work really, and it might get to the stage that the student just receives this, for example. So you had 79% and this is how you performed in question 1 and question 2. And we did have some students feedback to us, in particularly modules whereby there were only 2 questions. They then wanted to know, well, how did I do in part A and part B and part C of question 1? How did I do in part A, part B, part C of question 2? So there was a want there for further granularity of data. So that's what gets sent back to the student, and it gets sent back via a mail merge process. So the student gets an individual email to their inbox. It's got their name on it, so it's quite personalised. And then they have a PDF attachment. I could put some of the contents in the body of the email, but I just couldn't get the graph to work in the email, so they just get a PDF attachment there. In terms of feedback so far, the study at Cardiff, one individual student did say that the individual questions was valued for that student, and I've had verbal comments, the staff-student panel, had verbal comments to myself, verbal comments from academics that their students have really valued that information. In terms of staff feedback, again very small, but essentially the spreadsheet itself it was protected, so it didn't give individual staff members' flexibility. And some wanted to insert columns to add in section A, B, C, D. Some wanted to make their own notes as they go. So they wanted to say this one's gone for moderation or this has gone to a sample, etc. So I've had to take on board some of those comments and make it a little bit more flexible for staff members to operate. One of the points here, create statistics that could inform the generic feedback. We've now brought that process into this. So there's a real-time generic feedback report that hopefully we can send out to students along with their exam mark. So that's it really. I don't think it's anything too groundbreaking, but when you think that in January we did send out emails to 3,500 students with a breakdown of their exam mark in that email, I think that is quite groundbreaking, and it's something that I know the business school has never done before, because we do have huge numbers of students on modules. So in terms of what next, we're doing this for year 2. We've said that year 1 and 3 are optional, and academics are already coming forward to partake in the pilot, and I hope to work towards a full rollout. 17-18 as a pilot again, just to make sure we address all issues within the system, and then ideally 18-19 right across the school, and hopefully get that written into our CARBS assessment and feedback policy at a school level. In terms of opportunities and threats, legislation changes might make this whole process redundant, because rather than sending a breakdown of exam mark, you may as well just scan the paper, send the student the paper. And there are issues around opportunities to clarify feedback. So you send the student a breakdown, you're giving them more information, and they may come back wanting more information. So they may come back saying, okay, can you sit down with me and tell me why did I get a greater mark in question 1 as opposed to question 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. There's also another project going on with Tribal and the student data lifecycle contacts are looking into this to build this into SIMS and try to integrate this into the SIMS reporting as well. And then hopefully we can get systems embedded into SIMS to send out to students. So that's it.
Thank you, Natalie.